Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the Crossroads of the World Summit again this year. Cannot believe it's already been a year since our last one. Ambassador Lighthizer, that was fantastic, and you framed this discussion really well. I'd like to touch on a couple of your points and maybe go a little deeper. But you mentioned for the last, for 100 years, the United States had a surplus in trade with the world. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the top manufactured products in the United States were automobiles, home appliances like TV sets, radios, blenders, refrigerators, consumer goods, clothing, basketballs, toys. In the 80s, personal computer launched, and cars were still going strong. But we began to see a shift in consumables moving overseas. My mother, who is here somewhere, has a knack for saving really cool things. And like a year ago, I was at my parents' house, and I happened to find something I think you guys are all going to recognize. So, this extraterrestrial. Does anyone remember when this movie premiered? 1982. So, and I was 8 years old, and I got this stuffed animal. It's kind of heavy and firm. And Minister Ng, why don't you read, what's the country of origin? Where is that from?
Handmade in Korea. Handmade in Korea.
So isn't that interesting? In the 80s, thank you, you're welcome.
Super cute though.
We started to see things like toys move overseas to Japan and Korea. Like my G.I. Joes, the 4-inch action figures I used to play with, made in Hong Kong. China hit the scene in about 1980, or it began to hit the scene in a meaningful way. And Ambassador Lighthizer, remind us what happened that year.
Well, I would say, first of all, I think the point you're making is, to sort of relate it to what I said, what you saw happen was an industrial policy by the early part of the 70s. It was Japan. That industrial policy, and everybody said, well, the Japanese are just better at making this stuff. The Japanese, what they were better at was reading their currency, so that while a Cadillac would be really a Cadillac price, for a Cadillac price out of Japan, our car is fine. What was happening is you had like a Camry coming in at a Chevrolet price competing with a Cadillac. And the reason was they did two things really well. They manipulated their currency, and they had bank loans, which were actually zero, or in some cases, negative interest rates. So you would borrow money and pay back less than you actually borrowed. I can remember talking to Japanese steel companies. I should just, by way of background, say that when I was deputy USTR, I was sort of famous for sort of taking on Japan. The very old people there still remember me as being sort of a famous one on this, on this kind of calling them out for what they were doing. But I was talking to a Japanese steel person about putting in continuous casting, and I said, but how do you overcome the hurdle rate? And this is a senior business guy. He says, what's a hurdle rate? Right? They literally had zero interest rates. There is no hurdle rate if you can just borrow money. So if you go down what the products you did, and we were told by the economists, by the way, oh, go ahead, let them, they'll make our socks and our t-shirts, we'll make their computers and their cars. And of course, the profoundly kind of racist notion is that they were incapable of making cars and computers, which of course they are capable of. But you saw an evolution of their industrial policy, and we lost those things. We lost to consumer electronics. We lost textiles. Not because of economics. Some cases economics, but mostly not economics. And then we started to lose automobiles to Japan when they got in there, when they had these extraordinary advantages. So they had a closed market, currency that was way undervalued, and then, zero interest rates on borrowing. And I could go on. There's a lot more to their industrial policy. So to me, that evolution is for sure true. And the other thing I would just say by this kind of footnote, not quite what asked, so those kinds of things that were Japan, Korea, and then ultimately China, those are all things that hit our economy, and that was the first China shock. They didn't tend to hit Europe because Europe was then making complicated appliances and mostly automobiles. Now the second shock is coming in, once again the result of industrial policy, and it's crippling Europe.
So that was their industrial policy. You're absolutely correct. What did the United States do? What status did they grant China in 1980 that really...
First of all, in 2000, we granted China...
You're getting ahead of me.
Permanent MFN. We called it permanent normal trade relations. It was kind of a euphemism because no one wanted to give China most favored anything. So in 2000, we did that. Now, when I say permanent, before that, they had the lower tariffs, but they could be taken away by the Congress every single year. So there was a huge change in 2000 with respect to China. And you could look at from that going forward, a loss of 5 million manufacturing jobs. As I say, for 15 years, absolutely flat median family income in America, and the beginning of all these very bad outcomes that I articulated in my remarks.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. You ruined my crescendo a little bit, but yes, you're absolutely right. So, and the U.S. granted most favored nation status, as you said, went permanent in the year 2000. That began in 1980, and that was renewed annually until 2000, when it was made permanent. And so then, kind of fast forward, 1994, Ambassador Seade, what happened in 1994?
You probably refer to the creation of WTO. Comes into effect on first...
Of NAFTA, the NAFTA agreement.
The NAFTA agreement, yeah. It comes into effect on, I think it's 1st January 93, I think it is. Let me go back a little bit. Mexico had a terrible period, the 1960s, 70s, not terrible, but a pronounced affinity for protectionism. It was a very closed economy, and that worked well for a while. Mexico grew like few other countries. It was called the Mexican miracle in the 1950s and 60s, into the 70s, but it was basically building on the domestic market and forcing foreign companies to invest in Mexico if they wanted to tap the Mexican market. That was a biggish, promising market. But all that was investment based on loans, lending, debt. We were not producing the resources to invest through exports because Mexico was a protectionist country. It was not exporting a lot, not relying a lot on trade. And this led in the 1970s and then 80s into terrible crisis for Mexico and for the world. A major financial crisis in the early 1980s that affected the whole world, actually, certainly the whole developing countries around the world. And so in 1986, Mexico turned around and became very much of an open economy, very addicted to open trade. And so in 1988, President Salinas, who was the brain behind those changes in policies in the previous administration, he comes into office in 1988 and begins to go around the world trying to find export markets, goes to Europe, big trip to Europe. I was his ambassador in Geneva, in the GATT, negotiating the creation of WTO. That's why I thought we were referring to that. And he discovered that Europe was very busy thinking about Europe. So he came back to Mexico, got 3 or 4 of us ganging together on thinking what to do. And we proposed to the US what the US had been suggesting to Mexico for a while, which was to agree on what became the NAFTA. And so Mexico went strongly into an open trade economy that continued for 30 years or so, and continues now. We are still a very open economy with free trade agreements with over 50 countries. But NAFTA then superseded by a much wider, deeper, superior agreement called USMCA in the United States, which I had the honor to negotiate with this gentleman on my right. And this, I'm not going to describe in any detail. It was described very effectively by Bob, but came into effect and began to deepen our transformation and our commitment to trade. And as Mexico is concerned, our commitment to open trade globally, but first and foremost with the United States and with Canada. And it was an agreement that I believe has worked. The NAFTA worked fairly well. I mean, I listened to Bob's remarks, very enlightening, and 99% I buy completely. But I have to remark that the US car industry, for example, which has been the flagship of American manufacturing, had its heyday in the early decades after the Second World War, 1950s, 60s. It was the car industry of the world. But by the 1980s and the 90s, the US car industry was in serious trouble. Chrysler was about to go bust, and Ford and General Motors were weak. And I believe it was the NAFTA that by integrating a very efficient production machine throughout North America, the 3 countries, that turned around that industry. And that industry that had been the flagship of American industrial power became the flagship of North American integration and North American industrial power, with a huge input of all kinds from Canada and huge input from Mexico that grew over time to become the 5th biggest producer of cars in the world, but in a very integrated way, with parts moving between the US, Canada, and Mexico, crossing borders up to 8 times in the car industry, and becoming a strong industry again in the year 2000, 2010, and so on, until we began to be challenged again by the Chinese car industry. That is a separate story. But I believe the USMCA played a powerful role in re-engineering the competitiveness of our region. Trade between our 3 countries, trade Mexico-Canada, was very weak, as Bob said, but it has more than tripled in that period. It is now our 2nd most important trading partner, vying with China, certainly way behind the United States. Trade expanded for the 3 countries. The agricultural sector in the US has benefited a lot. Industry became efficient again on an integrated basis, while at the same time, resources and talent in the US moved largely from traditional manufacturing to new industries, where the United States is at the forefront, competing with China in some areas, but certainly very strong in science, in applied science, in high tech, and so on. So I don't think we're doing badly at all. The agreement has had some difficulties. The main one that was alluded to has had to do with compliance, that there seemed to be important amounts of steel and other products that are imported into Mexico, maybe Canada also, but certainly Mexico is alleged, which is then certified as being Mexican for the purpose of achieving regional status, so as to have free trade flow between the three countries. And that may be true. I believe that is true to some extent, and that needs to be tackled. But you don't throw away the agreement because there is a problem of compliance. We have to deal with compliance, and I think that's very important and quite possible.
Absolutely, and it's just incredible that we have three people on the stage right now that were directly involved in creating and implementing the USMCA agreement. I mean, I grew up in New York, and I remember in the 90s that the garment district in New York was hollowed out. What was manufacturers turned into showrooms of finished product that came from overseas. I remember New England, up and down New England, where you had knit mills that were making T-shirts and PK polos when they shuttered. And what you're saying, Ambassador Lighthizer, is very reminiscent of that memory where the working class just lost those jobs. Minister Ng, I'd love to get your take on this. How has USMCA performed? Where do you see pain points that may be renegotiated?
Well, it's really terrific to be on this stage with both ambassadors and former colleagues. I would agree with both in terms of USMCA. I think USMCA, in the way that it was renegotiated, is an excellent agreement. And the reason I think it's an excellent agreement is because it created the conditions for a very competitive, and I would say an even more competitive North America. And I think we need to be strong in terms of the scale and scope in North America. I was just coming from the Milken Institute Summit over the last couple of days and did a very similar panel, but the people who were on the panel with me were businesses from Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And I thought that the representative who was the CEO of the American CEOs Roundtable described USMCA in this way, which was, it isn't like your traditional agreement where it is, just greater market access, reduction of tariffs, and so forth that you might do with other economies. It really was and is a co-production agreement that integrated our economies so that we could leverage the very best of each of our economies to the benefit of the North American economy and to be competitive against non-market economies. One of the examples that the Canadian company shared with the group, he is a auto parts company. He employs about 6 or 8,000 people in Mexico, another 4,000 here in the United States, 3 in Canada. The parts move back and forth several times, and the efficiency of how they have now worked together and have inputs to create finished goods here in America has essentially created a net win-win and a win. And some of the issues that I think helped that was a very intentional approach that we all took to do much more regional value creation here in North America. I think the rules of origin that we negotiated were strong. I think there's probably some work that needs to be done there to ensure that that there is compliance to that and that we actually strengthen that. And maybe I'll sort of share this. What he said was, look, in his case, when he creates a plant in all 3 countries, he's paying for the land, he's paying for the labor, he's paying for all of what it takes to actually create those plants. Contrasts to a heavily subsidized plant somewhere else of our competitor. So my view is that we ought to find ways to, in this review, to tweak and to resolve, as you said, some of the issues, whether it's transshipment issues, whether it's tighter origin issues. I know in Canada, we implemented a country of melt and pour, which was really important during those negotiations so that we can actually have confidence, so that, so that Bob and his successors actually would have confidence in the production in Canada that would come into the North American market. I think that there are issues like that we should really double down on, but we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is an agreement that largely works. I say it largely works because the numbers say it largely works. It works. It has, since USMCA has come into place, we have seen an enormous growth that has benefited all three countries, and we should go from there, from strength to, I would say, greater strength.
Agreed, and that's the beauty of the arrangement, is that we are so much stronger together. Ambassador Lighthizer, as we consider China, which is really the manufacturing superpower of the world, with a $1 trillion, maybe more now, surplus globally, you mentioned you don't believe in free trade or fair trade, you believe in balanced trade. How do we as a continent approach that surplus?
Well, first of all, I think that one of the big issues that's going to come up is the kind of involvement between China and Mexico. It's the most serious issue, kind of geopolitical issue in this renegotiation. One of the things that's happening, and I should just make this point, when I say we've gotten out of balance, I think that the United States and Canada have a relatively balanced trade relationship. If you exclude energy, which I exclude, I always look at the numbers both ways, with and without energy. The United States has a small surplus. I focus more on goods. Services are also important, but the numbers are so bad in services, you never know what you're looking at. With respect to Canada, with respect to Mexico, though, the number is very large and it's growing. And so Mexico's surplus with the United States now is about just less than $200 billion. To give you an idea, Mexico's GDP is probably less than $2 trillion. So that would suggest that about 10% of their GDP is a surplus with the United States. And if you say probably 30% of their entire GDP are shipments just to the United States. So, that is out of balance. Once again, I personally don't focus an enormous amount on bilateral relationships, but that to me is a problem. And what you have seen is massive investment in, this is not the whole problem. I think a lot of it is rules of origin and some enforcement and the like. But you've seen a very large investment by China in Mexico. You have seen a certain amount of transshipment that's just literally not permitted, but they're getting away with of Chinese goods into Mexico. You have seen a certain number of kind of fulfillment centers in Mexico where they ship stuff to Mexico to then be sent in smaller batches to the United States. So this whole relationship with China and Mexico is going to be something we have to keep our eye on. Now, in fairness, President Sheinbaum understands this and realizes, or seems to. I shouldn't say that I don't know her, but she seems to understand it. And she realizes that it's not in Mexico's interest either to just transship Chinese value to the United States, either through substantial transformation or just through fraud. And there's a lot of that, a fair amount of that going on. So that, my guess is you could reduce that $200 billion number fairly quickly if you could get the Chinese content out of it.
Ambassador Seade, please, your thoughts?
I mentioned compliance and transshipment before, not because it is so important, the numbers don't suggest it is, but because it is mentioned a lot as a major reason why the USMCA has to be completely revised. which it is not. I think it is a question of application of the rules rather than changing the rules. But back to the question of the deficit of the US with Mexico, I think it is a sign of efficiency between the two countries. By far the biggest investor in Mexico historically has been, and in the last year has been, in the last 5 or 10 years has been, the United States. It's the biggest investor in Mexico, far bigger than China. Chinese investment is coming, as German and Japanese, but by far, Canadian, but by far more American. Why does that make sense? Because we are building regional efficiency. And it is good business for the American companies to invest in Mexico so as to produce certain things that supplement what they do produce in the Rust Belt and in elsewhere in the United States, and that what comes from Canada to do well collectively. Now, if you invest a lot in Mexico, you are generating a macroeconomic basis for there to be a surplus on the trade side, because the dollars have to balance out. Somehow the dollars that come in either get accumulated or come back the other way. If there is investment from the US in Mexico, there will be a surplus from Mexico to the US. That's the kind of basic truth that is sometimes not taken sufficiently into account when analyzing these things. The United States has a big deficit with Mexico, as with China, largely because it has a huge public deficit as well. If you spend more than what you earn, you have to find that extra difference between what you spend and what you earn and what you produce by bringing it from somewhere else. But I think the relationship between Canada, the US, and Mexico is basically a very effective one, creating greater and greater efficiency to be able to compete with China. And the competition with China, which is very important, is a big problem for the US and it's a big problem for Mexico, we have to address in a different way, which we can come to that if your questions suggest that. But I don't believe that within our region these imbalances represent anything else than rationality from you guys, investors, investing where the money can give you more of a buck for your money and more of a bang, and that creates a deficit structurally.
Look, I think it's just alarming kind of how China is investing around the globe. I mean, you look at Africa, the infrastructure being built, and what they're doing, kind of mining and leaving a mess. And Latin America, Mexico's no exception. Panama Canal had to be addressed. Look, even in our own state, we have our governor and legislature are dealing with China. It's aggressively trying to buy certain parcels of land here, and they've taken action to prevent that and to force sales of a certain percentage or over it's Chinese owned. So, Minister Ng, love your thoughts too.
So, what I wanted to actually share a little bit was, again, kind of where it works and where deeper integration and collaboration here in North America makes sense. And North America, with our other allies who also believe in the rules-based trading system, whether it be in Europe or Japan or some of our G7 colleagues. If I think about the way in which USMCA was implemented, I thought I would sort of make 3 points that is just illustrative of what we can and have done and what we should be doing more. One really great chapter that got negotiated into the USMCA was a chapter for small and medium-sized businesses. These are extremely, extremely important. And to get these SMEs into our regional value chain really means jobs and economic development all across our countries, and it's really, really hard to do. SMEs take a whole lot more work to have them not only grow in our own economies, let alone trade and get into our global value chain and supply chain. What we were able to do there through the 3 countries were quite intentional, and we're really sort of seeing some numbers move there. I thought that was great. And I thought I would use one example because, when I took over as trade minister, The agreement was already negotiated, so and all three countries decided that we would have this thing called a Free Trade Commission. So all three trade ministers every year would do essentially like an AGM and take stock of how well it worked. To talk, this one example stuck with me around how the three countries worked really well together on an example that I just thought, when it came through, I thought, gosh, it's such a small thing, but it's illustrative of what we do all the time. And it was a very specific kind of threading that was used in fire hoses for firemen. And the factory that made them in the United States closed. They were no longer making them. So you were sourcing, and the choice was, were you going to source from where you could get them? And you could easily get this outside of the region, also for cheaper. But there was very intentional work because it was fire hose. It was deemed to be important for our overall security. That the sourcing, they went to Canada, couldn't do it, but found it in Mexico. So, and it was a small company, right? So this very intentionality of this, of our agreement, encourage more of that regional collaboration. And then the final thing was, during COVID-19, all of us saw the fragilities of relying or over-relying outside of North America, and it caused companies to really think about what we needed to do and how to invest and how we do much more here in the North American context. And one of the committees of USMCA actually looked at how to deal with pandemics or emergencies, because what we experienced during the emergencies, even within our own three countries, gummed up things. I mean, export restrictions or just the inability to move things across our borders actually gummed up. And that committee actually did some really, really terrific work. I mean, I guess what you're hearing from me, if it wasn't clear, is that I am a fan of this. I think that we should work very hard. I think it's going to be, I think it's going to be a bit bumpy. But I do think that if I were to say one thing from the American business community, if you think that this agreement serves you in Utah, and Governor Cox took a great trade mission to Canada just a few months ago, keep doing that. And I think keep talking about why this is really important to your economy, because it's equally important to our economies as well.
There's so much at stake here, and I think just hearing Ambassador Lighthizer talk about the aggressive industrial policies, these foreign policies, it's just never more important than ever to, in my opinion, to be working together. We're close allies, we're friends, we always have been, and I thank each of you for your great effort in putting it together in round one, and for your insights going into round two. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, let me make one point which is just rolling over in my mind. I'm sitting here thinking that all of these things that we talked about during the negotiations, Mexico and Canada disagreed with us on universally. And the reason I say that, it was because it was funny. I was talking to one of the ministers on the other side, and I won't say what her name was, but I remember saying, when she was sort of publicly proclaiming how this or that idea that I was promoting was a bad idea, I said, be careful when you do that, because in 2 or 3 years you're going to say it was your idea. So you don't want to have a record out there saying you don't want it. So I say all that sitting here listening to how great the agreement is. This is wonderful. I'm glad that you all have come around.
Thank you very much.